we were discussing the manner in which the British established the early nucleus of imperial power in Bengal. And we said that 1765 was an important turning point, since it gave the company access to local revenue, and it gave the company a certain space in the political system. In this episode, we are going to examine how, from this nucleus of power in Bengal, which of course included parts of Orissa and Bihar as well, the company began to move westwards by gradually establishing its control over Awadh. Now, historians, of course, are divided over the issue of why this westward expansion. Some people argue that it was largely to protect the nuclear zone in Bengal, that control over Awadh was needed to ward off the Marathas and the Rohillas moving from the west. Others would argue that in the process of establishing some kind of political control in Awadh, interest also began to develop. The company was interested in the revenue of the province. Company had certain financial advantages. The company was involving the king or the ruler of Awadh in various kinds of structures of domination. That is the kind of argument that comes up. And some people label it as a kind of indirect rule. In 1765, even after the defeat of Sujah-ud-Dawla, the Awadh administration was not directly taken over by the company. The company allowed Sujah to function, allowed him to reorganize his administration, but the real control began to be exercised from behind by the company. So this is what is called indirect rule.
Sir, how is indirect rule a part of imperial strategy?
Very often this distinction between indirect rule and direct rule is overemphasized, but there is a difference. Bengal was, for example, a directly governed territory where all the laws or the legislations or the rules were promulgated by the company's government directly. But in an area under indirect rule, the indigenous rulers were allowed to perform, allowed to function. For example, in many of these princely states which came up in the 18th century as a consequence of the decline of the Mughal Empire, became tied with the company through various kinds of treaties, a system that Wellesley had set up called the system of subsidiary alliance, by which all these princes were willing to provide the company with financial support for maintaining a large army, and in return accepted the company's paramountcy, accepted the company's right to intervene in their government occasionally, and this was what was called paramountcy. And this particular strategy was continued till the second decade of the 19th century. Then on, there was a clear shift in policy represented by Hastings of Moira, and later on more powerfully by Dalhousie, where indirect rule was no longer preferred and there was preference for direct rule. An annexation of Awadh took place, as you know, during Dalhousie's tenure as Governor General in 1856. And then after 1857, once the British realized that this annexationism had produced unwelcome, unnecessary grievances among the princes, they reverted back to this system of indirect rule, so that at the time of independence, almost 1/3 of the territory of India was under the governance of these princes. So this is where indirect rule is somewhat different from direct rule. But in my assessment, whether the British were directly ruling a territory or not, if indirect rule sufficed, if indirect rule continued to provide them with the necessary advantages of political control, of resources, then why should they bother about direct rule? Because after all, direct rule entails responsibilities. So that is the reason why very often indirect rule was preferred because of the certain kind of advantage that the British had in maintaining control. So that is the kind of explanation that one can give about the notion of indirect rule, and this particular strategy of establishing an indirect rule in Awadh was followed from 1765 onwards. And as you know, Shuja-ud-Dawla virtually became a subordinate ally of the British, and it involved a very important alteration in the status of Awadh as a state. Awadh was not a mean princely state, was not a mere successor state. The ruler of Awadh was the wazir of the emperor, the hereditary wazir. When Awadh becomes a subordinate ally of the company, particularly after that treaty of 1765, it certainly involves, as you can anticipate, a very significant change in Awadh's status. So this is something which needs to be grasped. You can realize how this status was changing.
But sir, how was Awadh's status transformed into an ally of the East India Company?
It's a direct answer. It's pretty visible, but because after all, the Mughal combination suffered a decisive defeat at Buxar. So Shuja-ud-Dawla had to accept the terms that the British were offering. But that was not the end of it, because after that, there were other devices, other instruments of control that the British began to adopt over time in order to deepen their hold in Awadh, in order to exert greater amount of control over Awadh's government, and in order to therefore turn the Nawab virtually into a subordinate ally. So the process that had begun during Shuja-ud-Dawla's reign as the ruler of Awadh, as the Nawab of Awadh, continued through the later half of the 18th century and then in the early part of the 19th century, continued till Awadh was formally annexed. The point that I am trying to make is that the annexation of 1856 certainly was a significant event, but one has to look at the long process through which Awadh's status was transformed into a subordinate ally, and the greater amount of control that the company began to exercise over Awadh's government, so that the annexation of 1856 didn't make much of a difference. Already the company was very much powerful, was dominant in Awadh. So it is important to look a little more deeply into the kind of strategies, the kind of instruments or the devices that the company had adopted in order to deepen their control in Awadh and in order to exercise a greater amount of invisible control over the Nawab himself. So one of these favorite devices was the renewal of treaty. It is very ironical that each time a Nawab succeeded, he had to sign a new treaty. So no treaty was sacrosanct. So the Treaty of Allahabad was not sacrosanct. Once Shuja-ud-Dawla died, a new treaty had to be negotiated by Shuja-ud-Dawla's son Asaf-ud-Dawla. So Asaf-ud-Dawla had to concede many things. Asaf-ud-Dawla had to give them extra financial privileges, increase the amount of subsidy that the company demanded from the Nawab in order to maintain a large army. We have just said that one of the main arguments was that the company was interested in Awadh to create a buffer against the Rohillas and the Marathas moving from the west. So on this ground, the company wished to maintain an army using Awadh's revenue. And every time a new ruler came in, and every time a new ruler succeeded, the passing one, a new treaty had to be signed. And every time a new treaty was signed, the company demanded extra money. So, and you are familiar with the sordid story of Chait Singh of Benares. In 1775, when Asaf-ud-Dawla succeeded to the throne vacated by throne of Shuja-ud-Dawla, who died, Asaf-ud-Dawla had to comply with Hastings's pressure of seizing the hidden wealth of the Begums of Awadh. So it was a very sordid affair. It happened in the early part of the 1780s. Benares was ceded to the company in 1775 at the time of the renewal of the treaty with Asaf-ud-Dawla. And Benares also led to a sordid affair with Chait Singh. The Chait Singh who was a feudatory of Awadh, who rebelled against this increasing demand by the company on Benares's, on his financial resources, and therefore the rebellion took place and Chait Singh ultimately fled to Gwalior. Think of 1797 when Asaf died and Wazir Ali was the legitimate successor, but Wazir Ali was then removed. Sadat Ali Khan was brought back, was installed in the throne in the place of Wazir Ali, who was known as the rebel Nawab of Awadh, who didn't accept company's terms, and ultimately the company decided to remove him. So Sadat Ali Khan signed a new treaty whereby a certain territory of Awadh, including Rahilkhand, Doab and Gorakhpur, had to be ceded to the company. So you can see the size of Awadh was also shrinking. Ultimately, it was basically the region surrounding Lucknow and Faizabad, the core area. But Rohilkhand passed into the company's hand. It is very important because Rohilkhand was annexed to Awadh only a couple of decades earlier, when the company and the Nawab were great friends. So historians describe it as fatal friendship, because this kind of friendship, which actually leads to the shrinkage of the territory, depletion of financial resources, the growing control of the company over the revenue of the state, the growing intervention of the company in administration, the growing privileges of the company. For example, the company's officials or people who are dependent on the company were virtually exempted from our system of justice, some kind of extraterritorial right that the company's servants managed to acquire. And that was also extended to company's dependents. Whoever the company chose was exempted from from the criminal jurisdiction of the Nawab. Creating extraterritorial privileges, establishing commercial hegemony, getting involved in revenue administration, slicing away territory from the Nawab's control and adding them to directly ruled territory of the British. All this made the company a very important actor in Awadh's government. So that is a point that it has to be taken into account if we wish to see the process through which the systematic undermining of Awadh took place and finally made the annexation of 1857 a kind of a fait accompli.
So if it was an indirect rule, how did the company become directly involved in that?
That is a very important question. That is where my point is relevant, that the company system of indirect rule had many variations. I mean, the nature varied from one region to another. And as long as indirect rule gave the company enough control over commerce, over the territory's political life, over other kind of strategic, militarily important strategic points, the company was happy with that. Take, for example, the way the company became involved directly in the government of Awadh through their control over the revenue resources. Revenue was, as you know, was very important, because every time a new treaty was signed with the Nawabs, the company had to be given a subsidy on the ostensible ground that with this money the company was maintaining an army for the defense of the Nawab's territory. But the Nawab frequently was in arrears. So the company became a creditor to the Nawab. So the Nawab was a debtor. Nawab was indebted to the company because the Nawab was failing to pay the required sum of money in time. So there is a huge increase in the demand for subsidy. And as the Nawab was failing to pay these arrears in time, the company demanded that these should be converted into revenue assignments. So in order to recover the debt, the company became a revenue assignee. The company was given the revenue farming right in certain territories from which the company would be able to extract revenue and thereby would make an attempt to redeem the debts. So the company became involved in the revenue administration. There were occasional rebellions also in some of these regions where the company became revenue assignees. The company's forces were deployed to suppress these rebellions. The company started directly controlling the appointments in crucial administrative positions. Supposing The Nawab had preference for one individual and the resident didn't have this preference, the resident would move the Calcutta authorities to persuade the Nawab to change the appointments. So the company's nominees would be holding crucial administrative positions. The Nawabs would be changed also. For example, as you know, the case of Wazir Ali, I have talked about Wazir Ali. Wazir Ali was the natural successor in 1797 after Asafuddollah. But Wazir Ali was not acceptable. Wazir Ali was very defiant, so Wazir Ali had to be removed. And Sadat Ali Khan was brought in. Sadat Ali Khan was Asafuddolah's brother. So they were placing their nominees in crucial administrative positions. They were changing natural line of succession by installing their nominees in the throne. All this actually made virtually Awadh as a kind of a subordinate partner. But in this context, one should actually take note of the fact that towards the close of the 18th century, around 1797, when Richard Wellesley became the Governor General, there was a certain change in the imperial vision. There was a certain change in the imperial strategy for a variety of reasons. And Wellesley actually began to project a grand imperial vision, and one of the Wellesley's plans was to take over Awadh or to acquire Awadh, to turn it into a directly ruled territory.
Sir, what changes in the British imperialism did Wellesley's tenure represent?
So that is an important question, because by the close of the 18th century, a new generation of officials started coming to India. The early officials were merely merchant adventurers. They came to India, they wanted to make some money, they wanted to go back to England to live the life of nabobs. But as 18th century drew towards its close, a new crop of officials began to come to India who had grand imperial vision. Aristocrats. Marquis of Wellesley was a British aristocrat. Cornwallis was a member of the British aristocratic elite. So these aristocrats imbibed grander imperial vision, regardless of whether these new territories which they wished to acquire would generate profits or not. Not so much mindful about commercial profit, more interested in territorial expansion. And Wellesley was one such person who didn't mind if the company lost a few shillings or a few pounds in order to carry out a forward policy. And in the process of carrying out a forward policy, Wellesley had many schemes. I mean, you know, the subsidiary alliance was one of them, but Wellesley's plan for Awadh was somewhat different. He had a certain idea about how to acquire Awadh as a directly governed territory, how to make Awadh a directly governed territory. Ultimately, it didn't succeed because there was intervention from above, but certain areas were acquired. You know, I was talking about this treaty of 1801 with Sadat Ali Khan, by which Rohilkhand and certain other territories like Doab or Gorakhpur. Doab was a very important fertile area, very productive, very rich agriculturally. Gorakhpur, all these areas became a part of the company's directly ruled territory and formed the province of northwestern provinces. That was a territory which became the directly ruled territory of under the direct rule of East India Company, and Awadh's size contracted. So it is also very interesting that at a time when Awadh was becoming increasingly insignificant, was only nominally independent, was virtually losing control over their own men and money, Ghaziuddin Haidar, who became Nawab in 1814, assumed the title of the Padshah. And this is one of the great ironies of history, that a Nawab who virtually had lost control over his men and money wished to project himself as the Padshah, the emperor of the world, the ruler of the world. And some people say that this was an attempt to camouflage the weaknesses of the government. But
Sir, is this the significance of this particular event?
No, we do not know exactly what the significance was, but we can guess. I mean, one answer should be that as the Nawab increasingly realized that the entire office had become completely important in the presence of the British resident, the British resident had emerged as the real controller of affairs in Awadh. He wanted to comfort himself psychologically by acquiring the title of the Padshah. But I would say that there was a hidden British agenda as well. Because if the Wazir of the Emperor could be persuaded to proclaim himself as the Padshah, competing with the status of his own master, the Mughal Emperor, or at least theoretically, then the British agenda of desanctifying the office of the empire, the office of the Mughal Emperor, would succeed. So it seems that secretly the Nawab was, although the British publicly disowned this measure, or this particular event of the Awadh Nawab acquiring the imperial title of the Padshah, secretly they might have encouraged him to acquire this title in order to desanctify the Mughal imperial authority. And as you know, that from the early part of the 19th century, the British had this habit of addressing the Mughal emperor merely as a king of Delhi. There was a deliberate design on the part of the British to undermine the status of the Mughal emperor. So maybe it was a part of that great design that the British had already begun to develop in order to expand further westwards towards Delhi, in order to establish its control over northern India, and then from northern India further west in Punjab. So that is the kind of territorial ambition for establishing a far larger territorial empire. So the kind of structural change that you can see in Awadh happening during this period when the rulers of Awadh were nominally independent, but were losing their control over men and money, the office of the resident was becoming increasingly powerful. And the power of the resident was becoming more oppressive from the early part of the 19th century. It is very interesting that that was the time when the residents had begun to force the Nawab to give them loans. So the company was becoming the loanee, becoming the debtor. The Nawab was the creditor. And this was one way of extracting money, that you give me loan. And the Nawab was forced to increase the amount of loan on condition, and the Nawab imposed this condition that you return this loan, although the rate of interest was very low, much lower than the market rate. The company needed money. They could force the Nawab to give them the loan, and the repayment was be made on the basis of a very low rate of interest. But the Nawab introduced a condition that you repay the interest in the form of a certain guaranteed pension to their dependents, to the dependents of the Nawab. So in the process, the repayment of the interest on loan was creating a vested interest through which the resident was becoming powerful. Because the Nawab's dependents, the aristocrats in the Awadh court, were interested to become the guaranteed pensioners, or the guaranteed pensioners who would receive the interest on the loan that the Nawab had given to the company. So in this manner, the resident was becoming a key person. The resident had the ability to control a large army. He was disbursing their salary. The resident was actually, on the basis of the interest that the company was expected to pay to the Nawab, was making money available for the noblemen of Awadh. So he was attracting noblemen to his own court. The resident's court was competing with the Nawab's court in splendor. He was able to create a loyal and pliable clientele. So the Nawab lost his control over his own men and money. So if you look at this process, of how the company was establishing itself as a key factor in the administration of Awadh, how territories were sliced out, how the territory of the Nawab was shrinking, how the resident was becoming an alternative focus of authority to always trying to undermine the status of the Nawab, then you can see that despite indirect rule, the company was the master. So when the annexation took place in 1856, it only formalized a change. that had already taken place through the course of the early part of the 19th century. So if you look back from the vantage point of 1857 to 1765, you can see the process of unfolding. And gradually the company was becoming more powerful, and certainly the company would be more powerful in 1819 than it was in 1760s. So it's a gradual ascent of power on the part of the company in the region. The company was interested in slicing away territories from the control of the Nawab, and Awadh was going to emerge as the stepping stone, as we were saying in the very early part of the lecture, stepping stone for expansion towards the west. So if you are looking at imperial expansion in northern India, if you are looking at the process through which the early nucleus of power was being slowly transformed into the grand empire of India, Awadh certainly significant. And Awadh's integration into the system of control of the company synchronized, as you know, with two major happenings in British imperial history in India. One was the complete destruction of the independent Sultanate of Mysore, which happened in 1799. You know, the 1799 was the Battle of Seringapatam, Tipu's defeat. And in 1818, the last resistance of the Marathas disintegrated. The Maratha combination suffered. The major defeat in 1818, the Maratha Confederacy collapsed. The British conquest of Maharashtra began. So to these events, we have to look, we have to study these events in order to get a comprehensive picture of how the dominion in Bengal was turning into the Empire of India. A system that Wellesley had set up, called the system of subsidiary alliance, by which all these princes were willing to provide the company with financial support for maintaining a large army, and in return accepted the company's paramountcy, accepted the company's right to intervene in their government occasionally, and this was what was called paramountcy. And this particular strategy was continued till the second decade of the 19th century. Then on, there was a clear shift in policy represented by Hastings of Moira, and later on more powerfully by Dalhousie, where indirect rule was no longer preferred and there was preference for direct rule. An annexation of Awadh took place, as you know, during Dalhousie's tenure as Governor General in his administration, but the real control began to be exercised from behind by the company. So this is what is called indirect rule.
Sir, how is indirect rule a part of imperial strategy?
Very often this distinction between indirect rule and direct rule is overemphasized, but there is a difference. Bengal was, for example, a directly governed territory where all the laws or the legislations or the rules were promulgated by the company's government directly. But in an area under indirect rule, the indigenous rulers were allowed to perform, allowed to function. For example, in many of these princely states which came up in the 18th century as a consequence of the decline of the Mughal Empire, became tied with the company through various kinds of treaties needed to ward off the Marathas and the Rohillas moving from the west. Others would argue that in the process of establishing some kind of political control in Awadh, interest also began to develop. The company was interested in the revenue of the province. Company had certain financial advantages. the company was involving the king or the ruler of Awadh in various kinds of structures of domination. That is the kind of argument that comes up. And some people label it as a kind of indirect rule. In 1765, even after the defeat of Suja-ud-Dawla, the Awadh administration was not directly taken over by the company. The company allowed Suja to function, to allowed him to reorganize the manner in which the British established the early nucleus of imperial power in Bengal. And we said that 1765 was an important turning point, since it gave the company access to local revenue, and it gave the company a certain space in the political system. In this episode, we are going to examine how, from this nucleus of power in Bengal, which of course included parts of Orissa and Bihar as well, the company began to move westwards by gradually establishing its control over Awadh. Now, historians, of course, are divided over the issue of why this westward expansion. Some people argue that it was largely to protect the nuclear zone in Bengal, that control over Awadh was needed. We were discussing the